Hey guys, it's Timothy here. So this video is going to be a little bit awkward, and I'll tell you why. The full spoiler is actually out for Aether Revolt, but I've yet to review the cards between Wednesday night and the full spoiler today. Today's Friday. The reason for that is I actually recorded it, and there must be something wrong with my recording technology, or I'm not doing something right, so the file was deleted, or the file was unable to save after I finished it, which is a good like 30-40 minutes of video lost, unfortunately. So what I could do is just go over the full spoiler, but then I'd have to go back and forth between a couple cards and be a little awkward, and I really like to do the full spoiler in chunks, so that I can keep the colors all consistent, and I can kind of get an idea of how good a color is based on the commons and uncommons. Remember, the full spoiler, the good 70-80 cards that we got this afternoon is going to be the gist of what we draft with, right? We've seen a lot of different stuff, but mostly rares and mythics. What we're going to be looking at, starting with the full spoilers, commons and uncommons. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to break that up into 3 videos. I'll do like artifacts and green cards together, and then red and blue, and then black and white, or whatever order it comes in based on the website I'm using here. But what I want to do first is back up and go ahead and go through the cards that came out yesterday on Thursday, because I haven't talked about them on camera yet, or at least haven't successfully recorded them on camera. And the first card to mention here is Hidden Herbalists. Now, Hidden Herbalist is 1 in a green for a 2/2 uncommon human druid with Revolt. When it enters the battlefield, if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, add double green to your mana pool. Green to your mana pool. So, at its base, this is a bear, which is fine. And I've already mentioned there are a lot more bears in this set than there were in Kaladesh, which is great. So it makes the bear a little bit better. It makes it better against all the 3/2s that are out there, which there's a good number of. And this card's actually just pretty sweet. Like, you'll play it on turn 2 if you have to. You really kind of want to, I don't want to say combo, but you really want to combo with it, because it's pretty cool. If you have Revolt active for the turn, I'm using air quotes on active, you know what I mean. If you've had a permanent leave the battlefield, it means Revolt is active for the whole turn. Just some Timothy language there. But anyway, you get to play this guy. You get 2 green mana, and you get to chain it with another 2-drop from your hand, which is pretty nice. So it essentially makes this a free 2/2. A lot like Burning Tree Emissary. Yes, the mana is a little bit stricter. You need to have a use for double green, so you know this isn't going to let you drop your double black card or anything like that on turn 2 or turn 3 or whenever you have to play it. It's also uncommon, so it's not very likely that you're going to chain a bunch of these together, but it's pretty sweet, and it works really nicely with the green-white Revolt creature. If you can get this back from the graveyard with it, you get to just set off this great chain of like little bears for just 3 mana investment, which is nice. So this card refunds itself, which those type of cards are always pretty sweet. And if you can do that early enough in the game that the 2/2 body is still relevant, I think we've got a real card on our hands. But again, I don't know what the odds are that you'll be able to build a Revolt deck, but if there is such a thing, Hidden Herbalist is one of the reasons to be in that deck. Moving on, we have Treasure Keeper. This card's really great. 4 mana for a 3/3 uncommon artifact creature. It is a construct. When it dies, you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land with converted mana cost 3 or less. You can cast that card without paying its mana cost, and then you put all the other cards on the bottom in a random order. So it's kind of like a cascade trigger, except on dying instead of on casting, which is more fair, but keep in mind this is an artifact creature, so there's no real mana requirements. This is the type of card that if I did not open a bomb rare or something to really give me direction in my draft, I would be very, very happy to pick it up as my first pick, because it's just solid. This is a hill giant with some real upside. You know, it's going to replace itself with a card. It may not be the best card, obviously. If your deck is full of combat tricks and counter spells, then it gets a little bit worse. But if you can hit any relevant permanent or any kind of removal spell off of this, it should be pretty good. And I think the percentage of it being good is leaps and bounds above the percent of it just kind of blanking or anything like that. And 3/3s for 4 mana are still playable cards. Maybe not the best stats in a set full of 3/2s and stuff like that, but still playable cards, and you can crew this, you can sack it to trigger its ability, so on and so forth. Bunch of things you can do with this. So type of card I could happily see myself first picking in a draft and just moving on from there, since it doesn't commit me to any colors. Yeah, great card. Great card. Kind of like Matter Reshaper, but a little bit less restrictive on the mana requirements. As funny as that sounds, I'm not going to talk about the Planeswalker deck cards. There are some, I don't know, I guess neat cards, but those aren't relevant for limited purposes, and I don't see myself ever playing with them. If you like, if you want to see what they are, then go check them out, but I don't want to spend time on the video actually talking about those cards, because they're not going to pop up in your draft and sealed pool. It's not something that's going to help you get better at pre-release next weekend, so it's just my opinion. Here's an interesting one. I think it's bad, but we'll see. Hope of Girapur is 1 mana for a 1/1 legendary Thopter, legendary artifact creature Thopter. It is a rare. It has flying, and you may sack it until your next turn. Target player who was dealt combat damage by Hope of Girapur this turn can't cast non-creature spells. So I look at this and I see potential, right? It's not like this is going to stop your opponent from doing some mid-combat shenanigans or using a removal spell or something like that, because you have to have dealt damage with this during the turn you sacrifice it for it to have any sort of ability. Otherwise, it's just a 1/1 flyer for 1, and even making that an artifact instead of a colored permanent is just not good. A 1/1 for 1 in an artifact, even being an artifact, doesn't make it better. It's just not it's not a whole card's worth of an effect or a whole card's worth of power for you to be playing a 1/1 flyer for 1. That's an argument for another time. So you're really looking to see if that ability's worth it. In my opinion, it's really not. Like, what it stops your opponent from doing on their following turn, keep in mind you sack it on your turn because you had to have dealt combat damage for it to be relevant, and then the effect lasts until your next turn. It stops your opponent from like really doing a lot. It stops them from doing draw spells and stuff like that, or using, you know, some bomb, instant, or sorcery, but it doesn't stop them from playing creatures. They're just going to play a creature on their turn. Best case scenario, they're a spell deck and you just get to blank them. So I don't know if this was built with constructed purposes in mind or something along those lines. It's also legendary, which is kind of weird, but I assume that's to stop you from like comboing off with them or something like that. I have no idea, or copying it and stuff and sacking it and so on and so forth. But altogether, in limited, I would say stay away from this card. It is playable, but it's like in the lower dredges of playable, to the point where I don't see myself playing the card very often. And really, if you sideboard it in against a spell deck, it's not even going to be that good. It gets blanked so easily as a 1/1. It's whatever. This is a card that I've heard a lot of people excited about, and I think it's fine. I don't think it's amazing, and it's not something that I'm like dying to open. But Lifecrafter's Bestiary, I don't think that's the actual English name. I think that's just translation on the site. But 3 mana for an artifact. You at the beginning of your upkeep, you scry 1, and whenever you cast a creature spell, you may pay 1 green mana to draw a card. If you do draw a card. So you have this little incidental engine going where you get to scry 1 every turn, and that's a nice ability, but not worth a card on its own. Normally you want that on some sort of creature that can do some blocking or maybe even attacking or something like that. On an artifact that doesn't really do much else, you know, it's whatever. The second ability is really what you want to be looking at, and it's very restrictive. This is a green card by all means. It doesn't, I mean, it's weird that this isn't like a cycle or anything like that. It's just a green card, and that second ability is very powerful in a green deck, but it's also not the type of card that I think I pick up early. I'm not sure. It's very powerful in a green deck, but it's not the type of card that I want to pick up and just suddenly start drafting a green deck. I want green to be open and then open this card in the reverse order. And like I said, if you're not drawing a card for casting creature spells, then it's not particularly good. You could splash this with a couple green sources in your deck, and then it'd be like okay at best. But I'm not sold on this card until I see it in action, and I do see the potential for me to change my opinion on it. I will have to see how it plays out. Keep in mind, this is like cards like Durable Handicraft and stuff like that ask you to play your creatures off curve if you can, so that you can draw cards off of them, and that's usually worth it. But in this case, you're going to get started a little bit later because this is 3 mana artifact as opposed to like some 1 or 2 mana enchantment. But there's potential here. I just don't know how to speculate on this card without seeing it in action. And again, it does, despite being an artifact, it does drive you towards a green deck, which isn't necessarily a bad thing when we start looking at the green cards in this set. Boy, are there some green cards in this set. Moving on, we have a vehicle here. Aethersphere Harvester is 3 mana for a Crew 1 vehicle, and it becomes a 3/5 flyer. When this bad boy enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy, and at any time you may pay an energy. Aethersphere Harvester gains lifelink until end of turn. Kind of interesting that you can do that while it's not a creature, but whatever. So yeah, this card is pretty powerful, and I don't know how else to say. This is like a slam dunk first pick. It's not so bomby that it will just win the game on its own. It will if your opponent doesn't answer it over the course of a longer game. But it's a very good card for getting you in the game. It's a card for being proactive in the early game if you draw it early enough. So it's very flexible, super strong. It has a high enough toughness to be relevant against a lot of other flyers, which is great. And that lifelink, just like a card like Multiform Wonder in Kaladesh, this is the type of card you might need to top deck in order to get back in the game because of those lifelink swings. 3 damage in both directions is a lot when you're able to lifelink it. So the Crew 1 is really what sells me on this card. Crew 1 is trivial most of the time. It's not irrelevant. It's not something you can just passively ignore, but it is pretty trivial to tap a Crew 1 vehicle, which is why Smuggler's Copter is so busted. And, this is close to Smuggler's Copter. The lifelink is a little bit worse than the loot. I would say most people would agree on that, but it's still relevant and it's pretty cost efficient. The 1 energy, you get at least 2 activations off of the Harvester itself, which is pretty nice. Keep in mind, if this thing just straight up dies, you get a little bit of energy. That's not worth a card, but it is a bonus if your opponent removes it. Right on, we've got Green Boros Charm. Heroic Intervention is 1 and green for a rare instant. Permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. I don't know why this has to exist. The bane of all of my commander games are cards like this. But anyway, the card is good. When I first looked at it, I was like, yeah, that's pretty cool. But I'm started to evaluate it in my head, and the flexibility on it is super strong. You can use this to just blank a removal spell on a single creature in response to that removal spell, which is fine. It doesn't have a boost on it or anything, so it's not like, it's not as strong as like Blossom of Defense if that's all you're doing for the turn. But it protects all of your creatures, all of your permanents nonetheless, and it protects them in multiple ways. So it stops them from being swept up to board wipes. It stops them from dying in combat. It stops removal spells for the turn. It just does so much for such a little bit of investment, and there's a lot of flexibility in the way you can use it. The best case scenario, in my opinion, is your opponent attacks with a bunch of stuff, or you attack with a bunch of stuff, and your opponent makes some bad blocks or something along those lines, or some blocks that look pretty favorable to try and slim down your board, and then your opponent goes to remove one of your creatures with a removal spell, and you just get to completely blow them out of the water with this card. Not only are your creatures not going to die because of indestructible, but you get to blank the removal spell because of hexproof too. And there are some corner cases where you can protect like an artifact or a land that your opponent might be targeting, because it does give hexproof and indestructible to all your stuff. So pretty sweet. I like it as kind of a one-sided fog if you can use it that way. So a combat trick is where I want to be using this, but if I have to use it to just blank a removal spell, my 2 mana instant for your 5 mana removal spell is still pretty good in my books. And then it means that your opponent might not even have good attacks that turn if they're playing like sorcery speed removal, because your creatures are still just indestructible for the turn. So very powerful instant for green. I think I would first pick it. I honestly do. I think it is that strong, and it's not the type of card you can expect to come back, because somebody will pick it. Moving on, counter spells, I hate them. Metallic Rebuke is 2 and a blue for a common instant with Improvise, so you can tap down up to 2 artifacts to make this thing cost 1 less for each artifact. So it could potentially be a 1 blue instant. You counter target spell unless its controller pays 3, so kind of an expensive mana leak. with improvise, which is fine. You know, I'm not a big fan, and this is just it's not the anti-blue player in me, it's the anti-counter magic blue player in me, that counters just aren't super effective and limited because they're good on curve and then they just start dropping off, especially counters like this where your opponent can actually get out of it by paying mana. Sometimes in the late game they're not great, but they do their job. They're like the definition of filler to me, and in my opinion, being able to tap down artifacts that make this cheaper doesn't really sell me on it, because you're still probably not casting this like on turn 1 or 2 because you need artifacts down. Ideally, you could play an artifact on turn 1 and then have a cheap counter spell, a 1 and a blue counter spell available on your next turn. But if you're countering something that early, it's just fine. So you could play this in a controlling deck, but controlling decks want to go long, and you want hard counters really when it comes to limited, if you want counters at all. If you have your Burrell and you just want to play bad cards, then go for it. Maybe this card's better than I think, but cards like this, counter spells like this, in my opinion, they're never amazing. There are very few situations where they just completely get your opponent, but every now and then you'll lose to a aptly timed counter spell, so they do have a place in limited. It's just something I don't normally recommend playing. Play at your own will. Some people love counter spells, and if that's your style, be my guest, but leave me out of it. Anyway, Ravenous Intruder is 1 in a red for a 1/2 uncommon gremlin. Sack an artifact, gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So a Tog, right? But a gremlin a Tog. Is a Tog a 1/2? A Tog is a 1/2. Neat. So this is like a Nantuko Husk style card. A for red, and also B for artifacts instead of creatures. So it's an artifact sacrifice engine. Yeah, you can sack like servos and stuff, which is kind of what I'm seeing here. But in my opinion, I don't think this card's great. There are situations where you have a bunch of artifacts on board and you just smash your opponent for a lot. But, the lack of trample or any sort of evasive ability on this leads me to believe that, it's not that great. There's a lot of random token generation flying around in Aether Revolt, probably less than there was in Kaladesh, but still token generation nonetheless, and that makes cards like this worse. Because if you're not sacking an artifact, this isn't a card. A 1/2 for 2 is not good. You need to be able to fuel it consistently, and it's just not fantastic. One thing to keep in mind, and I didn't mention this when we looked at Yeheni and the white-black enchantment that sacks things, is I was trying to think of a way to use sacrifice engines, and one thing to note is that it turns on Revolt pretty nicely. If you can sack something with a card like this, then you're not paying any mana and you're free to start revolting your cards out for the rest of that turn. But overall, this card's not great. There are times where it will be very good in your deck. You can use it as a finisher in the right situations, but overall, I'm not assuming this card's very good at all. I just noticed, though, it is on top of a Soul Ring, which is pretty sweet. The Invention Soul Ring. So I just noticed that. I didn't really take note of it, but pretty cool. And the card, not very cool. It's okay. I'm not going to say it's unplayable, but I won't be playing it in very many decks. And again, that's just my opinion. Everything I'm saying is my opinion based on experience, having not actually played this set. But moving on, this might be the last gold uncommon card, I think. Heretical Thopters. I don't know if that's the actual translation we're going to get or not, but 3 blue and red for a 2/2 human artificer, uncommon, like all the other gold cards. The cycle of gold uncommons. This one has improvise, so you could potentially get it down to blue and red by tapping 3 artifacts, and when it enters the battlefield, you get 2 1/1 flying Thopter creature tokens. Now, 5 mana for a 2/2 and 2 1/1 flyers is, in my opinion, a okay playable card. If it did nothing else, I would play that some amount of the time, probably a little more than 50% of the time. Think of Experimental Aviator, the 0/3 flyer from Kaladesh that makes 2 Thopters. I play that quite a bit. I think it's an underrated card that people don't appreciate as much as they should because of how much it combos with other things. Going wide is a real strategy. Blinking creatures like that with enter the battlefield triggers are great. Your Panharmonicon decks want it. If you have something like Chief of the Foundry, then those flying tokens really spiral out of control quickly. And I could see a lot of that happening here. Plus, Improvise is already encouraging you to play some artifact-based deck, and it's not unreasonable to think that you could play this on turn 3 or 4 pretty consistently. Probably turn 4. turn 3 is like probably the ideal draw, depending on what what your decks look like. But this is a strong card. I have no doubt in my mind, and I could see myself playing it pretty consistently. If I see it coming around, it's probably a good sign that red-blue is open, because I do think the power level's there. But again, like I've said for almost all of the gold uncommons here, it's not a card I'm excited to first pick. I don't want to force myself into red-blue for this card, but I think it's a nice advantage if you are already in the colors to then take the card. That's kind of how these gold uncommons work out. I'm only saying that for all of them because in Kaladesh there were some gold cards that I would absolutely first pick. Like I first picked Cloud Blazers and Restoration Gearsmiths and Whirler Virtuosos and Unlicensed Disintegrations and stuff like that. Like I would first pick those cards because they are super powerful. And I'm not saying these cards are less powerful, but they don't spike my interest as a first pick as much as some of those cards do. And again, this is just my personal opinion, so take that at face value. You may value those cards higher, you may value them less, so do what you think is right. Universal Solvent is 1 mana, 1 colorless mana for a common artifact. For 7 mana, you can tap it and sacrifice it to destroy a permanent, and that's all it does. This is the type of removal you play if you just could not get your hands on good removal, or if your opponent has some huge late game creature that you really don't have another way to deal with. For instance, if you're playing a red deck, a red base deck, red green or something like that, all of your removal is based on deal and damage, right? There aren't very many spells in red and green that are going to deal with some giant toughness creature. It's just not going to happen. So you may have to board into a Universal Solvent, but in my opinion, I would stay away from this as a main deck option. Maybe it's the type of card that you'd be happy to get at least one of. If you think Battle for Zendikar, there was a 7 mana instant called Scour from Existence. Just 7 colorless mana to exile a permanent. That wasn't even that good in a slower format where you could get to 7 consistently. I don't see this being good in a format where people can, you know, kill you on turn 4 or 5, which happens in Kaladesh sometimes. Yeah, the activation cost is just too steep. And it's not like this is even a good way to trigger Revolt because of how much it costs. If it was like a little bit more of a split, like 2 to play, and even like 5 or 6, I would consider it a tiny bit more. But I don't think I'm ever main decking this card unless the format turns out to be super slow, in which case I'm probably still not that excited about it. Efficient Construction is a weird one. It's a weird one. It's a build around, definitely. It's 3 and blue for an uncommon enchantment. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. So you get a Thopter for casting a spell, an artifact spell specifically. But and let me just come out with my opinion about it. I don't think this is worth really grabbing. First off, if you draw it like you're just top decking or something, you're looking for gas and you draw this, it's not going to do anything. And a lot of times, even if you play this on curve, it's not going to do anything unless you have a lot of expensive artifacts or something like that. Because a lot of times, if you have this in your opening hand, you may have to play awkwardly, skipping parts of your curve, not maximizing on your mana to really get this to be as efficient as it should be. No pun intended on that, by the way. But also, if you are playing on curve, then you're casting all your cheap artifact spells, right? So by the time this hits the board, you have very few cards in your hand, and you need to hope that you're just hitting artifact after artifact. Now, if my deck is, 5 blue cards and the rest is all artifacts, then go crazy. But remember, this is a cast trigger. Now, with that being said, that is powerful. Turning all of your artifact spells into an additional 1/1 flyer is pretty strong. So it's not something to laugh at, and I could see this taking over a game. But if you compare this to something like Whirler Maker, yes, Whirler Maker is a little more mana intensive, obviously. It usually doesn't do anything the turn it comes down, just like this. And sometimes it doesn't do anything because you have to use your mana for other things. But sometimes this doesn't do anything. But the thing with Whirler Maker is whenever you need a 1/1, you have that 1/1 available to you as long as you have the mana untapped. This one, there may be times where it just doesn't do anything, which really sucks. I'm kind of saying it's a little bit worse than Whirler Maker, but Whirler Maker is not even a good card. So that kind of gives you an idea of what I think about Efficient Construction. And that's, again, without having played the set, it's kind of hard to evaluate a 4-mana build-around enchantment like this. But a lot of times a card like this just won't net you a lot. If it nets you like 3 Thopters over the course of the game, that's probably fine. 4 mana for 3 1/1 flyers is okay, but it's still not that fantastic that you need to like first pick it out of a pack and just go hard on it. I have no idea how to evaluate the card, but my inclination is that it's not that good. Now, we're not going to click these ones because this is another cycle similar to the Thrive-In cycle. There's one common in each color that has the same ability to it. The only difference is the mana costs are different, the power and toughness spread is different, and the types are different. But they're all commons. They all have this effect that when they enter the battlefield, you get 2 energy, and they have an additional effect where when they attack, you may pay 2 energy. If you do, you create a 1/1 servo token. So keep in mind, that means every one of these creatures provides token generation to their color. So red, white, blue, green, and black all have some sort of token generator here. And 2 energy for a 1/1 seems fine. The different, and they kind of made up for it by making the creatures a little bit underwhelming. They're a little bit below curve. So, for instance, Aether Herder is a 4-mana 3/3. And, it's an elf, artificer, druid, which isn't an irrelevant creature type. And it has that ability. The white one is 3 and a white for a 2/3. So inherently weaker than the green one. But this one has vigilance. It is a dwarf artificer. They're all artificers. The Aether Swooper. Aether Swooper is a 1/2 for 1 and a blue with flying. And those energy abilities. It is a Vidalcan Artificer. It is, it's a flying Vidalcan, which is whatever. Still not like a 1/2 flyer is, okay. For 2 mana. Aether Poisoner is 1 and a black for a 1/1 with the ability. This one has Death Touch, though, which is pretty relevant. This can hold down the fort pretty nicely. It's kind of weird, or Death Touch is both an offensive and a defensive ability in that, like, you could just hold this back, but the activated ability really wants you to go in on attacks, but Death Touch means that, your opponent may not want to trade off their creature and you just get a servo out of the deal, which is pretty nice. And if you think about it in the long game, 1 and a black for a servo token and a 1/1 Death Touch is pretty strong. And you could say that for most of these cards. Like, 3 and a white is pretty strong for a total power of 3 and 4, like a total power toughness of 3 and 4 across 2 bodies, one of which is an artifact. And you could say that about all of these, but they're a little bit on the weaker side. But you got to think about the long game. Not to mention that the ability is repeatable if you have more energy and you're able to attack consistently. Finally, the red one is 1 in a red for a 2/1 with First Strike, which is also relevant, especially in an aggressive color. And then, attack, pay 2 energy, get a servo. I like the red one and the black one the most. I think the other ones are just okay, which is fine. The green one's fine. The white and blue ones are unexcited in my opinion. But the red one has a relevant keyword ability, First Strike, which means that it's probably going to be able to attack in there pretty safely, at least if you're playing it early enough. And the black one, is a good defensive card if you don't need to attack or make the token, and a pretty good creature on offense if you want to consistently make tokens or something like that. Your opponent's just going to have to trade off for this eventually, right? They're all commons, though, and it's kind of annoying that there's a 1/1 common Death Touch, but that happens sometimes, and you have to find a way to deal with it. All right, moving on. We have Midnight Entourage. Cool card. 2 and double black for a rare 3/3 Aetherborne Rogue. Your other Aetherborne you control get +1/+1. Not just your Aetherborne creatures, your Aetherborne enchantments and your tribal Aetherborne sorceries. They get +1/+1, but whatever. Whenever Midnight Entourage or another Aetherborne you control dies, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. So this is really sweet. Yeah, we weren't expecting an Aetherborne Rogue. I had fingers crossed for a Gremlin Rogue, and we did not get it, so I'm really disappointed. And no, I don't count the Mimic as a lord. But this card's cool. It's Again, a Hill Giant, a 4-mana 3/3 with some very relevant abilities. At the very least, this one triggers on its own death, so it's going to replace itself. And yes, you lose a life, which can be a little bit of a detriment over a long game. But it's not like you're going to build an Aetherborne deck, right? When do you ever build Vidalcan decks? Yeah, even when you pull, what is it, the Vehicle Dwarf from Kaladesh, you don't like really build a dwarf deck, do you, or a vehicle deck? You just might incidentally have a couple of those. Yes, it incentivizes you to pick those up earlier. Like if I started my draft off with Midnight Entourage, and yeah, I think it's a playable first pickable card because it does replace itself. But you know, I might have some decisions where normally I'd be looking at a card like Prakata Club Security and some comparable vanilla-like creature, and, you know, it'd be one or the other. It didn't really matter. I would probably go with the Aetherborne because it does make this card stronger, and a good way to draft, without going into pro drafting tips or anything, is pick cards in the draft that make the rest of the cards you've picked better, or get better because of the other cards you've drafted. So if you ever draw additional cards from your other Aetherborne, this is fantastic. But don't just pick up like bad Aetherborne cards because you have this. It's already good enough on its own. And consider the first clause a little bit of an extra bonus. It's not legendary, so making a copy of it seems pretty sweet too. You draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, and it'd be a 4/4 for 4. Yeah, that seems pretty sweet. But very good card to start with. No doubt that this one's a very good card to start with. I don't think anyone would argue that. Herald of Anguish is 5 and double black for a 5/5 mythic demon with improvise, flying. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent discards a card, and you may pay 1 and a black to sacrifice an artifact and give target creature -2/-2 until end of turn. So just like Demon of Shady Schemes, this guy just has like 15 abilities all stacked up on him. 7 mana 5/5 flyer, probably a playable card, and that's like absolute worst case scenario. Improvise, especially on a 7-drop, usually means you're casting this for around 5 to 6 mana. And think about Gearseeker Serpent, how strong that card is, and how easy it is to play that. This is essentially like a giant flying black Gearseeker Serpent that also has a removal ability on it and gives your opponent, like, just pitches a card from your opponent's hand every time you go to your end step. So if your opponent doesn't deal with this, it's just going to win the game. It's going to leave them hellbent. It has an ability to pick off other creatures. You know, you already tapped a bunch of artifacts to improvise this, hopefully, so you have artifacts for the ability. And this just does enough that it's almost always a first pick slam dunk card. Like, I can't see opening up any other non-foil, non-rare card from the set alongside Herald of Anguish and passing something like this in the first pack. Obviously, if it's like pack 3, this is the type of card I don't want to pass, but I would for something that's better in my deck. But I hope I can pick this one up. Fun story for you. I have never, in easily 50-plus Kaladesh drafts, I have never opened Demon of Dark Schemes, which is a little bit sad, but I've also never played against it. So there's that. Herald of Anguish also looks cool. And one more thing about this. What's up with the art? Why is nobody concerned about this? Like, they're just like, oh, no, Anguish. It's the Herald of Anguish. I don't know. Maybe he's chill with them or something. It does bother me. It does bother me. All right. We all had a good feeling that we were going to get some dinky red legendary creature because of the expertise cycle, but our dinky red legendary creature is Kari, Skyship Raider. 1 in a red for a 1/3 rare legendary human pirate. Not even the only pirate in this set. Excuse me. With First Strike and Menace, 2 very relevant combat keywords. Whenever Kari Zen... let me try that again. Whenever Kari Zev, Skyship Raider, attacks, create a legendary 2/1 red monkey creature token named Ragavan that's tapped and attacking. Exile that token at the end of combat. So I'm not sure what the flavor is. She sends her monkey out and then the monkey like comes back, but it's exiled. It ceases to exist. But the monkey's still there, right? So think about what this is doing. You know, when you attack with her, you're sending in a total power of 3 a total power of 3, a total toughness of 4. you're okay with the 2-1 dying, right? If that trades with something, you're super happy about it, but it's often just going to get in there, and if it's not going to get in there and she's just going to die, you don't attack, right? You wait until it's vulnerable. Your opponent has to have a total of 3 blockers to be able to dodge all of the damage from this, or at least block all of the damage or do something about it. This is also the type of card that just punishes your opponent for missing a land drop early in the game. You play this on turn 2, you're able to attack for so much damage, and once they do play their first creature, you have Menace to back you up. It's never going to get chumped by First Strike, and because of First Strike by like servos or something. And if you think about the combination of First Strike and Menace, a lot of times what will happen is, in Kaladesh, somebody will play a Fabricate creature, and that makes Menace so much worse because they'll block with 2 things. But First Strike lets you pick off that servo before the other creatures deal combat damage to Kari Zev, and that makes it a little bit less vulnerable in combat, even though a 1/3 is not the most aggressive creature. But overall, because of the monkey that you get along with this when she attacks, I think Kari Zev is a pretty good aggressive card, and one that I could see myself happily picking as a first pick, and then trying to build an aggressive red deck. Although I think she is on par with some of the uncommons in this set. So I'm not saying she's busted. She's not as good as some of the other legendary creatures in this set, like the green one or the white one or anything like that. But she's fine on her own as an aggressive creature. The final expertise here is Kari Zev's expertise. Spoiler alert, it's probably the worst in the set of the expertises, but still a fine card. 1 and double red for a rare sorcery. Gain control of target creature or vehicle until end of turn. Untap it. It gains haste until end of turn. You may also cast a card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. So this is a little bit weaker. Even like you really need to take advantage of the cast in something part of this card in order to make it even a playable card. If you didn't have that 2 mana or that cast something converted mana cost 2 or less clause on this card, it wouldn't even be like a playable common. It'd just be like hijack or threaten effect. Like not even a good one. It doesn't make the vehicle a creature or anything. You still got to crew it, which is pretty annoying. It's still a sorcery. It's double red, which is annoying. But if you can cast a 1 or 2 drop off this and you're playing a pretty aggressive deck, it's pretty sweet. The problem with threaten effects is they don't help you develop the board. They let you get a little bit of damage in certain circumstances, but then you're usually using your whole turn against that. You really want to save them for when you're winning the game. And a lot of times people will play incorrectly and they'll use a card like this just to take something for the turn and deal like 2 or 3 damage. And it's not really worth playing that card, which is why you don't see cards like Hijack come up in Kaladesh very often. They just don't do enough. Kari Zev's expertise has the potential to be a little bit better than that if you can cast a 1 or 2 drop off of it. But if you can't, then I recommend not really playing this card. This rare, unlike Kari Zev herself, is one that I don't think I would be willing to first pick if my pack has better commons or uncommons to offer. And that's unfortunate because the whole expertise cycle has been super strong up to this point, and this one's just kind of a little bit shruggable. If you're all in aggressive, you might want this card because it lets you do multiple things. It lets you deal extra damage, potentially, and also develop your board at the same time, which is what you want to be doing in an aggressive deck. And with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and stop this video. And so just so you know, the next videos are going to be probably split into 3 because that's the full spoiler. And it's right up there on Mythic Spoiler. So I'm excited to start talking about them. I've really only glanced through them super quick. So it's going to be fun to look at them in depth. But I hope you guys will watch through those videos and give me your opinions. Hopefully by the time pre-release hits a week from today. And I hope to hear from you guys soon. So as always, my name is Timothy. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.